Hi guys, so I've decided I'm going to start a new little subgenre of my videos, and it's going to be Renee Regards, and I'm going to talk about classic books and have a discussion with you all about them, and they'll probably be pretty spoilerific because I'll just assume that you're watching it because you have read the book or you plan on reading the book, and in most cases because the classics are so well known it's kind of inescapable that you'd probably be aware of some of the plot points I'll discuss anyway. So let's get cracking with Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Now, I read this book when I was 19, I think. I spent the entirety of my teen years avoiding reading anything by any of the Bronte sisters, because everyone kept telling me I needed to read this and Wuthering Heights and Tenant of Wildfell Hall and everything, and I was just like, no, I'm not going to, because I was stubborn and contrary. And then finally I read this because the BBC TV miniseries was coming out in 2006, and so I wanted to read it before I watched that. And subsequently I watched, I've seen 5 of the TV or film adaptations. 5, because there are so damn many Jane Eyres. So yeah, I read the book first. And I did sincerely enjoy it. I find it very interesting, is the word I would use, and in sort of a similar way as to how I feel about Wuthering Heights, in that I don't necessarily like everything that happens in the book, and I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the characters' decisions and that kind of thing, but I still find it interesting because of that, because of that disparity with, you know, how I feel towards the actions of the characters and that kind of thing. Not nearly as strongly as with Wuthering Heights, where I hate pretty much everybody and everything in that book, but I enjoy it for that reason. It's very weird. Yeah, so Jane Eyre, if you don't know the plot, it's pretty basic, really. It concerns the upbringing of this girl, and the crux of the novel is centered around her going to be a governess at a place called Thornfield Hall, and she is tutoring a young lass named Adele, who is the ward of a dude called Mr. Rochester, and it concerns the relationship she forms with Mr. Rochester, and their romance, and a lot of dark secrets, and stuff goes down. But essentially, really, for me, the novel is about the progression and development and growth of Jane as a character. And everything else that happens is everything else that happens, but I see the crux of the novel as being her growth and her coming into her own, which I find infinitely more interesting than anything else in the book, even the relationship with Rochester. So, we see child Jane for a little bit at the start of the novel, and is it just me, or does anybody else really regret and mourn the fact that feisty, questioning, outspoken little Jane kind of disappears, and that aspect of her personality kind of gets subdued later on in the book? I love that she was very questioning of organised religion and such when she was a child, especially because of Brocklehurst, or whatever his name is, and the fact that he was very clearly a hypocrite and a really cruel, unlikable guy who postured about talking about faith and good and evil and all this kind of bullshit when he didn't practice it clearly, and also that she grew up in a household full of people who treated her terribly and yet claimed to be, you know, God-fearing Catholics and whatnot, and the fact that she questioned it quite outspokenly. And that sort of went away because of her interaction once she got to Lowood School, her friendship with Helen, and the fact that Helen, and Helen's goodness and purity and strong sense of faith changed the way Jane responded to that kind of thing. And that later became a very central part of Jane's character, the fact that she has a very, very clear and precise moral compass. Which is totally fine, and I like that aspect of her character. I find it interesting, at least, but I really miss the fact that we kind of lost the questioning, outspoken, feisty little girl that she was, because I kind of found some of the moral debate and things that go on later in the book, whenever Jane is reflecting on things and speaking of the nature of her faith and her relationship with God and that, sometimes got a bit heavy-handed and a bit difficult for me to empathise with, simply because it was she's so very pious and so very devout with her faith, and so I kind of regretted that we lost the kid who would question that kind of thing. So, you know, I like that about little Jane, but one thing I will say about the character of Jane herself is that she's probably one of the most fully realised and fully fleshed out protagonists, especially of a classic, that I've ever read myself. Certainly for a female character as well. And I got the sense throughout the book that she was just very, very realised and a three-dimensional human being. And so even when I felt a disconnection and disassociation with her, and I couldn't necessarily always agree with what she said or thought, and I would feel a bit of a distance, it was still, I still very much respected her as a character because she felt so very real and genuine, and she was quite consistent. And I really appreciated that, especially since she was our protagonist, and it never felt like you weren't getting a strong sense of self from her. And that, for me, was the most important thing, and I really appreciate that. One thing that's interesting, given all the film and TV adaptations, is that I don't think... I appreciate all the ones I've seen for different reasons, but I think that because it's so much Jane's story for me, it's interesting to watch the portrayals of Jane by all the actresses who I've seen play her, and the fact that for the most part I think they all take certain aspects of her character and do that very well, but I've yet to actually see a Jane who for me really encompasses the whole of her personality. The fact that she has very varying sides to her that, you know, I think in just in common literary society you see her as a very specific thing, and she's gained a kind of stereotype and is only painted as that, whereas she, aside from being very pious and very seemingly submissive and quiet and contemplative and all those sort of things that she's often portrayed as, she's also feisty in her own way. She's got a really smarmy kind of sense of humour. She loves to joke and muck about with Rochester especially, and she's got her own way of thinking, and she's very, very set in her beliefs. She's very opinionated. She's very, like, has a lot of self-pride and takes pride in her being she's a self-made woman. She, you know, works hard for what she has, and she's not afraid to admit that. She's a great deal more than I think what a lot of people tend to associate with her. And so it's interesting to see the portrayals on film, especially to see that for the most part I think people have taken different aspects of her and done them very well, but I've yet to see a completely, fully realised Jane on screen. The closest I think that it's come would be Zela Clark in the 1983 TV adaptation series thing. I think she, for the most part, hit upon more, ticked more things off than anybody else has done. But that's not to say I haven't enjoyed the Jane performances, because I really, really have, for different reasons. Yes, but Jane I just find as interesting as a character. Also, she brings up a lot of the very nature of her character and what she does, like the fact that she's a governess brings up a lot of social commentary on the fact of how governesses were treated and the fact that they stood in a very in-between position socially, and were very unsure and unstable of where they fit in, and were looked down upon, and kind of like how people treat bourgeois concept of society, like they were in the middle and so didn't have any I guess, friends on either side of the social spectrum, so they were kind of just sitting in this wedge, in this purgatory, without knowing what to do and where to go. So that in itself made her relationship with Rochester a big social taboo. Also just the fact that Jane is someone who is self-made and works really hard to get where she gets, and is determined that she will make her own decisions throughout. And that's like something I love. I'm just trying to find one of the quotes. Like later on when all stuff's going to shit and Rochester says, well, who in the world cares for you will be injured by what you do? And she says, I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. And even when you think her attitudes are a bit extreme and you think she might be talking a bit of nonsense, you still have to admire the girl because she is so set in her ways, and she's set in her ways because she knows sincerely, she feels that she knows what is best for her. And she is always going to be doing what's best for her. Which sounds so selfish and self-centered when you speak of it that way, but all I feel for her in the book is a lot of admiration. Even when I question stuff, like I question her, spoiler, I question her going back to him in the end, I really do, in some ways. I question her marrying him, but, you know, I do still, I'm very interested to know what people think about that, because I do feel like it's a bit of a cop-out at the end. The very famous line, Reader, I married him. There's been entire essays on that one line and what it indicates and what you can take from it. I felt kind of let down when she said that. I'm like, no, Jane, seriously? Really? But, I mean, You know, that's just me. I'd love to know what people think. I mean, I know we all probably want happy endings and stuff, but I was happy for her to just be back and being his mate kind of thing, but that's just me. Anti-romantic me. Rochester, probably going to have to talk about him. He's been his character for the most part in the film adaptations I've seen, I've been pretty happy with. I really liked Michael Fassbender, although I actually was expecting more from him, maybe because I'm biased and I have a high opinion of him and I thought he could do a bit more with it. But I liked him. I really liked Toby Stephens. I liked Timothy Dalton's performance. Syrian Hines I don't know, and William Hurt just didn't feel right. That was weird casting. But I think there have been quite a few effective portrayals of him on screen. He also, kind of like Jane, even more so maybe, has taken on a very distinct stereotype of the brooding, romantic, Byronic hero, and he also is a lot more than just that term that's been labelled, you know, and set on him. He especially has a really snarky, really sarcastic, really cutting and biting sense of humour, and he loves to joke around, and he's a big trickster, and you see that a lot in the book. Also, he's one of the few people, actually, who can sort of get away with the excuse of, I've had a troubled past, and that dictates my horrible actions now. Because he's a liar. He's a liar and a manipulator. And he's lying through his pants, not just to Jane, but to everybody else. And whilst I think it's interesting to compare him to Jane in that sense, because Jane had a really shit childhood too, and a really terrible upbringing, and horrible things have happened to her, and yet the decisions she makes and the reasons for it are very different from what Rochester does. You can still, however, I think, view his actions with regards to his past and think, okay, that's sort of justified, I suppose. But Rochester I do still take issues with, because at the end of the day, no matter how charming and kind of cool he is, and how much he did actually make me laugh, the surprising amount in the book when I first read it, still in retrospect, when after all the shit's happened, and you view back what he's done, and you realise the extent to which he's been lying and tricking everybody, whilst it's still understandable and he's a tormented soul and things, I still think, I don't know if I trust you anymore. And I remain kind of distrustful of him throughout the rest of the book. I still think he's an interesting character with a lot of facets going on. His relationship with Jane is interesting primarily because it is a relationship of equals. Like, they're very much one another's intellectual equal. And their entire friendship, like, kind of builds upon that mutual understanding of one another and a respect that forms, and the fact that they're always, like, having little jabs at one another. That's the other thing. Like, for as much shit as Rochester gives Jane and everybody, she gives a lot back too, which I really like. And I also love, like, stuff that, even though Rochester has taken on this thing in wider culture, this persona, he actually doesn't fit it when you read the book. I mean, he's not meant to be good looking at all, and he's not meant to be this dashing, really swarthy, romantic hero. He's not that, and I love, like, the little interchanges, the famous moment of, do you find me handsome? No, sir. And then at the end he's like, am I truly hideous, Jane? She says, yes, sir, you always were, you know. Like, I love that. That's great. And he always says to her, I think you're really plain, because everyone thinks she's plain. And she knows that too. I love that it's actually a love story between two unattractive people. I think that's cool. None of the films have done that justice, though, of course, because everyone's really Hollywood good looking, which is annoying. But there you have it. And I like that there's sex appeal for the both characters without them being quote-unquote stereotypically attractive. That's kind of nice too. Other stuff to discuss. The very, very famous trope that this book is infamous for, but it kind of created, I think it did, or at least it helped perpetuate it, of the mad wife in the attic is well known now. And Bertha Mason as a character is not fleshed out at all in this book. She's very much there to be a plot device, like an object really, for which things happen around and which Rochester's past is kind of hinged on. She's also there to be a symbol of the exact antithesis of Jane as a person. I think that it's great that Jean Rice wrote Wide Sargasso Sea. If you have not read that or seen some of the adaptations of it, certainly do, because it's really, really worthwhile. And it investigates much more heavily Bertha's backstory, which I think is a very worthwhile thing to do. And it might change your perception of especially Rochester as a character, but I don't think it will really alter your enjoyment of Jane Eyre, so don't feel threatened in that way. I think that it's very much, if you can get your hands on it, you will appreciate having read it, because Bertha is not given her dues in this book, and she is there to be the mad wife in the attic that messes things up. I think that I don't think Charlotte Bronte ever intended Bertha to be regarded in a negative light simply because of her insanity. I think it's a tricky topic that she addressed at all, given the time period this is set in, and I think that she did intend for Rochester's actions to be seen as a positive thing, that he did sincerely do the best he could given his circumstances with Bertha, and he tried to help her. Because it's true that, really, her situation in living at Thornfield Hall is a great deal better than it ever would have been had she been put into an asylum. And the very nature of how women's emotions and mental health was viewed back then, or rather not viewed, and just given this pigeonhole, and people were thrown into asylums for no reason. So I do think he did sincerely feel he was doing right by her with his actions. Your opinion changes if you read Wide Sargasso Sea, but, you know, I don't think that any malice was actually intended by Rochester towards Bertha in the book, and I think it's a shame that she couldn't have been more of a character in the novel, but as it is, she's still a very effective plot point, and yeah. Also, I feel a lot of people tend to criticise the portion of the book where Jane's away from Rochester. They don't like St. John as a character, they don't like his interactions with Jane, they don't like all that whole section, they find it boring and unnecessary and that kind of stuff. I find it really interesting, and St. John I quite like as a character. I feel bad for the guy. I also think he's, like Michael Fassbender said in an interview, he thinks St. John is every bit as messed up as Rochester, just in different ways, and I agree with that. And I find his interactions with Jane very interesting for that reason, and their whole discussion when it comes to the marriage proposal was really engaging. I love it when there's a TV adaptation of Jane Eyre, because you get more time spent with St. John, whereas the movie versions just gloss over him. So I think it was such a shame that Jamie Bell was St. John in the recent film, because he couldn't have more time, and I really wanted to see his portrayal, because he was quite a darker St. John, and I was really interested in that. But, yeah, I find it a really worthwhile segment in the book, because you have to remember that it's Jane's story. It's Jane's narrative, and we're following her journey, not just her with Rochester, and I think that it was a necessary portion of the book, and I've got no issue with it at all. I'm talking far too much. Everyone let me know what you think about Jane Eyre, and have you seen all the film versions? I've seen a great many of them. Let me know your opinions, and we can keep on chatting, and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte is a very worthwhile read, really interesting characters, and, yeah.